Good evening, Northern Colorado, and welcome to the NCARC TechNet. We meet here each Monday evening at 6 p.m. to discuss technical and other ham-related issues that we might run into as amateurs in order to learn and gain more experience and be able to help each other and to solve our own issues. We meet on the on this repeater, the 447.275, which also is linked to the 447.75 machine, although that link sometimes does time out a little prematurely. So just be aware that if you're tuned in there and you lose us, that's probably what's happening. We're also available on Echolink at W0UPS-R. So there's some choices. We're also available on our YouTube channel as it's being streamed to that medium as well. If we should have trouble with this repeater going down, we'll reconvene on the 145.115 repeater, which is in the same location, but on a different band. So just keep listening, and if you hear no signal whatsoever, we for a lengthy period of time, we'll probably reconvene there. We like to listen to all opinions and welcome feedback from people, and the ability of sharing our ideas with each other, and even contrasting views is certainly welcome, and we try to support and encourage that as well. Before we begin, I'll just say I do appreciate feedback from folks that are tuned in here. If you are wishing to make comments about the net, you have questions for the net, or questions about the net, please email us at Elmers, Echo Lima Mike, Echo Romeo S, Sierra. Wow, I'm not very good at that right now. Elmers at NCARC.net. Pose your question either for the net or for us to answer off of the net. I can't promise that I can get to the net emails right now, so during the net broadcast is probably not a good time to post to us for immediate feedback, but certainly after the fact, we'd love to have your comments. Another bit of business we should attend to is, I guess next week is Memorial Day. I don't know that I've got anything special going, but some of you may not be available or may not be interested, or some of you may not have anything else to do and would like to have net today. Let me ask it this way. How many of you would plan to be here if we had a net next Monday? Actually, let's do it this way. This will be a check-in question. So as I take check-ins here, indicate to me, along with your call sign phonetically, your name and your location, if you think you would be here to listen to the net next week or not. That will help me know whether we should go ahead and meet next week. So with that, we'll begin check-ins for the NCARC TechNet. Please call now.
Kilo Echo 0 Oscar Uniform Sierra. Nate from Windsor. I will not be available next week.
November 0 Echo Mike Papa Greg, Fort Collins. I should be available next week.
KE0BQ Alpha Echo 0 Bravo Quebec. My name's Daryl. I'm in Longmont. Are you reading? And I am available next Monday.
Kilo Charlie 0 Zulu India Echo. Darren, Fort Collins. Yes, I would be available next week.
This is Whiskey 0 Alpha Sierra Papa, W0 ASP, Terry in Berthoud, and I'll be here next week.
This is Kilo Echo 0, Lima Charlie Kilo, KE0LCK, the other Mike from Windsor, and I should be around next week.
KE0QPC, Kilo Echo 0, Quebec Papa Charlie. I will be here, Arlen, Fort Collins.
All right. Why don't we take a break and recognize and welcome KE0QPC, KE0LCK, W0ASP, KC0ZIE, AE0BQ, and you were, Daryl, let me see. Who was asking if we were receiving? I think that was you, Daryl, and you're coming in fine. So, perfect signal. N0EMP and KE0OUS. Welcome to all, and a pretty overwhelming response for being available on Memorial Day. So as far as I know, we'll probably think of going ahead and having a net even with this many folks, but let's see who else is in here tonight and what your answer would be as well.
Here's Kilo Delta 0, Tango Yankee Uniform, Joe and Loveland. Yeah, I should be around.
KE0OXV, Scott, Fort Collins. I'll be here, Kevin.
Kilo 0 Delta Bravo Echo, Debbie in Fort Collins, and I will be with N0EMP.
Okay, welcome to KD0TYU, KE0OXV, and K0DBE. Thank you very much. Anybody else would like to check in at this time? I do know that N0NYY was in here and will be back as soon as he is able to get a coax put back together. Anybody else this evening?
Whiskey 0 Delta Delta Zulu, Dave in Greeley, and I'm not sure exactly what I will be up to next Monday.
This is Kilo 0 Lima Alpha Oscar, Luann in Loveland, with Kilo 0 Papa Romeo Bravo, Phil, and we'll both be here on Monday.
Okay, W0DDZ, welcome, K0LAO and K0PRB. Let's see, so Dave, the only issue might be if we had a net that streaming might be impossible. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Let me, when I talk to Christy, I'll figure that out and let you know. Hopefully that'll be before the end of the net.
Okay. Well, Whatever happens, happens, and it's okay. And if nothing else, I can at least make an audio recording here that you can use for later. If you, unless you have some real concerns about us doing that, but we can discuss that before the net's over. Anybody else? Anybody else wish to check it, please?
KC0 RBT mobile. KE0MQA also mobile.
Kilo 0 Alpha Bravo Kilo mobile.
AA0RX.
SCX,
Quebec Oscar, not mobile.
Georgian Berthoud, fixed.
Okay, we had some doubles, so let me read who I have. KC0RBT, KE0MQA, K0ABK, AA0RX, KC0SCX. Anybody I missed in that last go-round?
Here's KL2QO. I think I doubled with somebody.
Okay, KL2QO, thank you. Yeah, we had about a three-way double there, or something like that, triple. Very good, thank you very much. Anybody else?
This is Whiskey 0 Romeo Delta Charlie, Rob, around Owl Canyon, and I will most likely be monitoring next week, Kevin.
Okay, welcome W0RDC. Thanks much, and thanks for your input on next week. Okay, let's go ahead and move to our discussion here, I think, at this point. And the topic today was RFI, essentially. Interference caused by electrical equipment, other items around us that can create major havoc with receiving signals. And more of that, beyond that, tracing that signal, finding where that source of noise is coming from, and then hopefully being able to deal with it in some way, shape, or form. This is a very open topic, so we have a lot of different angles of this that we could discuss. So let me just kind of open it up to thoughts. I have some immediate thoughts which I've been discussing with some folks before net, and that is interference here at the house with something that's definitely electrical, but that is going and coming a lot. I'm guessing it's outside the house, but I have not gone through the process of cutting the power and listening on batteries and disconnected from the grid to see about all of that. But these are the types of issues we have to deal with, especially when they interfere with our HF or weak signals of any kind and cause us problems hearing. Sometimes we have issues we cannot deal with or can't locate or can't have no control over. But at least knowing where they come from can be nice and can be very helpful if we know that we can contact the right people and see about having something done about it. Maybe, Greg, if you don't mind, I'll send it to you first to make some comments. I know that you've done a fair amount of signal tracing as you have the equipment to do that sort of thing, and I just wonder if you would like to maybe provide us some opening thoughts about it, both what we might look for, what we might need to do, what we might need to have available to do some of this searching for these the RFI sources.
Good evening, Kevin. Greg and 0EMP. Yeah, I've done a lot of tracking down on signals. Sometimes it's RFI. Sometimes it's kind of a strange signal, usually outside the amateur bands, that I'm trying to identify. And in the course of trying to identify it, I try to track it down to see where it's coming from. One thing I learned right away is before you get all geared up to go on a big expedition, check around your house and make sure it's not local. More than half the time, in my experience, it's been something on my property. So you can go around turning things off with a battery-operated receiver, and if that doesn't do it, then you start turning off circuit breakers, and then the whole house. And if you're still picking up the signal, then you go mobile, or start walking around the neighborhood with something handheld. So you want to do that before you hit the road and go driving all over town. That was one thing I learned right away. Let me let this reset. Just one other comment in general on this topic. The ARRL has a really good RFI book. It's called the ARRL RFI book. They're in at least the 3rd edition, and I am pretty sure that the 2nd edition that I had is in the NCARC library now. So our president, Joe, KD0TYU, runs a lending library for us, and I think there's 1 or 2 copies of that in the library. It's a great resource if you want to learn and study up on RFI and how to track it down and how to solve it. And 0EMP.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Anybody else want to add comments before we start entertaining questions? Anybody else want to add comments about this, the topic of searching and finding the RFI, and then doing something about it?
AE0BQ, I have a comment.
BQ, go ahead.
Roger, down here, at least at the Bark repeater and the Longmont repeater, we've had malicious interference, actually on several occasions. That's interesting, and it is a form of RFI. I'm not sure if anyone here has experienced that, but I just thought I would throw that in as a reminder that there are human sources of RFI. Over.
Yes, and we're certainly aware of that, and we've all had to deal with it at various times. And some of these same topics may apply to that, but the difference there, of course, is that it's going to vary a fair amount. Of course, regular electrical RFI is going to vary a fair amount as well, for various reasons, which will be interesting to cover as well. Just because a majority of the RFI that we're going to be dealing with is going to be perhaps more unique to us individually, that's going to to some degree rule out malicious interference. So I had thought we'd kind of keep to that, to the actual noise RFI at this point in time, just because that's going to be the absolute most common thing we're going to have to deal with when we are tracing down problems with hearing signals over electronic noise, especially since we have so much of it available to us. That's not disregarding that we have other problems. Anybody else want to make some comments here, and then we'll start entertaining some questions?
DDZ with a comment.
DDZ, go ahead.
Hey, Kevin. So one area that I know many people have had issues with is the dreaded alternator noise. And I was experiencing some of that in my van, and I was looking at filters and various things to try and quiet that alternator noise down, and then my alternator went out, and when I put the brand new alternator in there, the noise went away. So sometimes I guess what I'm saying is just the age of some of the equipment, like an alternator in your vehicle, could be causing the noise, and the alternator in my van was actually cheaper than the filters that I was looking at. So I guess I just wanted to throw that out there. W0DDZ.
Okay, very good, and certainly if you can save yourself some money, why not? So that's a good point. And we all know that the little wall warts do create a fair amount of noise themselves. We can talk a bit more later about what that noise is, why it is, and what we can do about it. But those units also wear out and burn out and stuff. So sometimes they're not as excellent a piece of equipment as we would like them to be either. Okay, this is N7GES with the NCARC TechNet. Do we have any questions for anybody at this point on this subject? Okay, so let me, for instance, talk about my situation a little bit and get some feedback from folks as to what we might be able to do about that. I've had several bits of input before the net happened, so this is a little bit of a manufactured discussion, not intentionally done, but just because it just happened to be that way, and it would still be good information. So I'm getting electrical static noise that appears as pulses first, and then the pulses get longer and longer until it's a continuous steady buzz. I've said that it actually almost sounds like an electric fence. As I was growing up on the farm, and we had those around, and they interfered with the AM radio, but they were somewhat brief little pulses of static that had a 60 hertz component to them. These are interfering with everything from HF all the way up to at least 2 meters. They are interfering with FM, sideband, and AM, fairly strong even on FM. What would some suggestions be that I should look for that? This is assuming that I've already checked my house, which I have not done, of course, yet. But we already know that needs to be done. I do have yet to do that. If I find, for example, that when I cut my house power and I'm running on a battery, I'm still getting this same noise, where would we take it from that point?
EMP.
EMP.
Yeah, I've had that type of 60 cycle noise before. A few winters ago, I had it really bad one winter, and it was like you're saying, it went from HF all the way up at least through 2 meters. And first of all, looking on an oscilloscope, looking at the audio on one channel, the audio output from a radio, and then looking at the 60 cycle line current on the other channel of the oscilloscope, I could see it was phase locked to the power frequency. So it was something arcing at the peak of every sine wave on the 60 cycle power in the neighborhood. We have above ground power lines here, and it had gotten into that somewhere and was re-radiating on the power lines. Trying to track it down on HF was extremely hard because the whole neighborhood above ground power line grid was just one giant antenna. So when you're in a situation like you have where it is radiating up into VHF or even higher, the smaller an antenna you use and the higher band you search in can make it easier to pinpoint, especially if you get to the point where you can use a handheld Yagi on VHF or even UHF. And if you're doing that, usually, if you have the ability to, if you put your receiver in AM mode, it's usually most sensitive to impulse noise in AM and 0 EMP.
Your oscilloscope, in this case, just helped you identify that, yes, indeed, we were dealing with 60 cycles, and to some degree, the shape of the noise clued you into what was happening there. Is that correct? I mean, you were able to see spikes that were synchronized to the 60 hertz?
Yeah, that's right, Kevin. So I actually had a 120 hertz buzz because I was getting a burst at the crest of both the positive and then a negative half of the cycle. It wasn't right at the peaks because there's some delay in the audio circuitry in the receiver, so it wasn't, I'm sure whatever the source was, it was actually arcing at the crest of each half sine wave, but by the time the signal got processed through a radio, through all the different stages, there was some delay added to it. So on the oscilloscope, it wasn't at the peaks, but it was locked in phase with them. You know, it was down the slope a little bit because of delay, but it was, time-wise, it was locked to the same frequency as the power line noise. So that helped to confirm that that's what that was.
Okay, so the big question is, were you able to locate it, and was it ever able to be solved?
Well, that brings up another point. You want to look and see if your noise is correlating to something. If it's always right at dawn and then right at dusk, it could be a street light switching on and off and being noisy while it's doing that. If you have like 10 or 15 minutes of noise as a street light's coming on at night, and then if you get some more as it's going off in the morning, it could be that. If you only have noise when it's windy, or if the noise goes away when it rains, it could be some loose power line equipment that's arcing, and then you know what the electric fences sound like. So if you can correlate it to something, that would help. In my case, it only happened below freezing. It never happened when we were above 32 degrees, and I suspected, because we have a lot of horses in my neighborhood, people that have horses and other large animals, I suspected it was a tank heater for an outside water tank, but again, with it getting in the power lines, I could really never track it down. And then we got into spring, and it was gone for good, and the next winter it did not come back. So I think something actually finally burned out and was replaced the following winter, and 0 EMP.
Okay, very good. Well, that's the part of the story that's always of interest is, did we find it? Did it go away? Were we able to find anything specific? Thank you. Other questions or comments?
W0ASP.
ASP, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize Greg's comments about this business with a source of radio energy radiating along the power lines. That can, as he said, make it very difficult to locate the source. There is another trick you can use. Most arcing also produces an ultrasonic signature in about the 60 to 80 kilohertz audio band. I once used a bat detector down in Puerto Rico to locate arcing inside of a transformer, and then reported it to the Puerto Rican power company, which promptly refused to do nothing. But I think Hurricane Maria solved that problem. Locally, I have a dish audio receiver, ultrasonic, about 2 foot in diameter, and it can be used to detect arcing in telephone poles, and you can locate these arcs to within a few centimeters. W0ASP.
Okay, thank you. Now, is your dish designed for that purpose, or is that for other purposes but just happens to work in this situation?
Kevin, the dish is sold by MFJ, and it is for locating arcs specifically. Yes, you can actually peer inside of or listen inside of transformers and tell exactly what part of the transformer is arcing.
Okay, very good. And the bat detector, I believe you said you used in Korea, obviously you modified for that purpose?
Negative. It was Puerto Rico, and we borrowed it from a university professor who did bat research, and it just so happened to downconvert bat signals, bat emissions, down to human audible ranges, and which is approximately the same audible ranges that are produced by these power line arcs. And the nice thing about the audio is it doesn't propagate along the wires.
Okay, very interesting. All right. Thank you very much for that. Additional comments from anybody or questions?
N0NYY.
Good evening. You got your wiring, your plug put back on. Glad to hear you, Bart. Go ahead.
Yes, my little radio is much happier now. It likes having an antenna. For the arc detection, I have also used about a 6-inch diameter coil of wire, usually light, thin enameled wire, 100 turns plus or minus, not really critical, hooked to a very small audio amplifier and a set of headphones. And the arc component has a very strong electromagnetic signature as well that is readily detectable with an audio amplifier and this wound, what I will call a magnetic pickup coil. That it's extremely directional along the axes, and if you're close enough, the tank heaters especially have phenomenally strong electromagnetic signatures, and you can snoop around with that just like you would with a DFing antenna or something of that nature. And just remember that the sound is on a line through the center and perpendicular to the sides of the coil.
You know, I used to use a telephone pickup coil to pick up noise from various things more for curiosity's sake. Never thought of using it as a as a way of sourcing noise, and it may not have been the the size and type that we needed for that. But it did reveal some very interesting stuff, and this was 20 or 30 years ago that I was playing with that. So interesting idea, and I could see where it could very likely work. So yeah, thank you for that, Bart, and thanks for the reminder of that we did discuss this before. So glad to have it documented now as well. Other comments or questions? Okay, we've talked a lot about ways of finding the noise electrically. Maybe we can talk just a little bit about the sounds of noise, what we might listen for, characterizing the sound. Mine is definitely like an electric arc, but it varies in its frequency of occurrence, or the length of its occurrence. So it starts out as short, maybe half-second bursts. Those bursts get longer and longer, and until it's a steady sound. That's just an example. We've all run into noise that doesn't have a particular tone or frequency component to it that you can recognize. It's just hash, just noise. I have occasionally had noise that is hash noise like that, but it creeps up and down the band, comes across your frequency, and then leaves. This is, again, home type noise, and we haven't even begun to talk about what people run into as far as RFI in the car. But would anybody have suggestions as to the types of noise that we might hear, and whether we can attribute it to something based on its sound or style of the look of it on an oscilloscope? Well, either of those two things, are there clues to what it might be from those things?
W0ASP with a comment.
ASP, go ahead.
Well, Kevin, more generally, most of these noise sources have some kind of fingerprint, much like a criminal, or a pattern of behavior. And, part of this whole thing about just finding out which is the noise source is a matter of figuring out the behavior. I think Greg mentioned two already, which are security lights, which go on at night and off in the daytime, and so there's that pattern. And arcing, which is always tied to the 60 hertz power line. If you have something that's not one of these, it could be along the lines of something like a switching power supply. All these little wall warts we have from China, which do not pass FCC requirements, by the way, but they're imported anyway, and those produce a lot of the kinds of noise you're talking about, those which are not stable with frequency.
Okay, any additional comments to that? I like the idea of fingerprint, because that's kind of what I listen for, at least, anyway. And I'm sure looking at them, that makes it very obvious, a correlation, I guess you'd say. Fingerprint, a common thing to actually look for and see. Any other comments?
EMP.
EMP?
Yeah, along those lines of what Terry just said, if you have any type of software-defined radio, where you can see a big chunk of spectrum, that can be helpful in characterizing a noise source. If it's a narrow band source but it's drifting around like you've experienced, and I've seen that too, you can see it moving around on the spectrum. And the other thing you can do is, if it's narrow band, you might be listening to a harmonic of the main source. So if you find an interfering signal somewhere that's pretty narrow band, check at half that frequency and a third and a fourth of that frequency, because you might actually see that the original source is lower down and stronger than where you happen to have come across it. Those things can help identify a source as well.
Okay, interesting. Excellent. And then I'm guessing that once you ran into the source, you're liable to be seeing a wider band of this noise. Although I suppose it could still be drifting then too, huh?
It can, depending on the source, and a couple people have mentioned the switching power supplies. If, for instance, it switches at 40 kilohertz, you might have a spike every 40 kilohertz, and it's just a bunch of harmonics if it's a square wave switcher. So, again, looking at spectrum, you can see that with some type of spectrum display, like from an SDR. So if you see that it starts down in the HF range and goes all the way up, but every 40 kilohertz, and the higher you go, the weaker it gets, you're looking at harmonics of some type of switching supply.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Other comments?
AA0RX.
RX, go ahead.
Yeah, Greg and I were checking out these frequencies, and we're wondering where the heck were they coming from, and decided to look at DSD Plus and decode them. And we were looking at the the REA, the Rural Electric Authority, and their actual vehicles were giving out DMR GPS coordinates for their vehicles, and that was tied to APRS. And at first we couldn't figure out what the heck was going on, and between Greg and I, we figured out what the heck we were looking at. It was kind of fun to figure that out. AA0RX, back to net control.
Okay, well, and that would certainly be moving a lot and changing in its strength and that sort of thing. But I'm guessing that would have had a very characteristic digital data sound to it, perhaps. Greg, if you can expound on that, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly, Kevin. It went back to what I was talking about earlier about sometimes trying to track something down in order to identify it. And in this case, we were looking at some signals we stumbled across using SDRs, and they were outside the amateur band, but I think it was the commercial portion of the 400 megahertz band above 450. And it was, like you said, it sounded like digital of some sort, kind of like DMR does if you're listening to it on a regular FM receiver. And Gary realized that was some software we'd been playing with. He could decode it, and we were getting GPS coordinates that were moving around, so it was obviously vehicles. And at the end of the day, all of those vehicles converged, or most of them converged, at the Poudre Valley REA office over there by Windsor, right around 5 p.m. So that's how we figured that out.
So we had noise print, or noise fingerprint. We had locations and patterns of where they were occurring, and ultimately a data interpretation, which you're certainly not going to get from every noise source, but a very complete picture of where something was coming from. That's pretty amazing. Probably not something you're going to run into every day, but still amazing anyway. Okay, very good. We know we haven't talked about mobile noise much yet, except for alternator whine. But heaven knows we've got lots of other stuff in our cars these days that produce regular interference, as well as the types of things that may not be producing interference on their own, but are amplifying interference and that sort of thing. Would anybody like to chat about that a bit? Well, to get things started, I'll mention a few things that we were chatting about before net. I was hoping that we hadn't circumvented the net by chatting about all of this beforehand, but not everybody was here. So I'll rehash some things, and that will bring up some additional thoughts and clarifications. With every car having a computer in it nowadays, and excuse me just a moment, I need about 30 seconds. Okay, back with you. Had a family situation I needed to deal with. Okay, where was I? Okay, so all the cars have computers now, and lots of equipment feeding into and out of those computers. And not only that, but some of that communication between the computer and other parts of the car is done wirelessly via various devices. So we get odd noises, but we also get things that happen at certain speeds and not others, or in certain driving conditions and not others. So lots of craziness there. Anybody like to make some comments about some of that and some of the things that we might discover, and maybe some of the ways that we might have to number one, find that, what it is that's causing it, and then what we can maybe do about it.
N0NYY.
I was just about to volunteer you if you didn't come in. Bart, go ahead.
Great minds. Oh, and ours, too. It reminds me of an issue that Mark MIC was having with his Suburban a while back. One of I believe it was an electric motor for was it the window or the wiper or something? Anyway, he was able to identify that because it was very, very noisy, and he could hear it in his car, and he could hear it through the radio. And somebody also had mentioned earlier, I don't know if it was during the net or before the net, that they had Dave, that he had an alternator that was failing, and it became very noisy prior to its failing. And very many times these noise sources are the result of a component failing. And I had a point when I started that statement, and I have lost what it was, and I apologize. It's been a very, very long day, and I'm quite tired. But the fingerprinting is, if you have the ability to capture the audio and look at it on a scope, it will tell you remarkable things. I have tracked down electric fence chargers that had issues, and it's very fun to look at that and analyze the signal and figure out what it is, where it is. You can actually watch the wire ring with the RF. You know, it's stimulated one time by the fence charger, but then the wire rings, and you can actually watch the ring deteriorate on the wire. And you can sort of calculate how long the wire is, or a multiple thereof, by looking at the frequency at which it rings and zeroing my wire.
This sounds like it could be a whole topic in itself, but fascinating. The idea of seeing the picture of the ring in the wire is fascinating, but you did mention that the pictures can reveal the recording, and then being analyzed by a picture can reveal a lot. Are there any more examples you can give us of the way something might look, or whatever, and what it might relate to?
Well, we've talked extensively about 60-cycle noise, which is, 60-cycle current is normally a nice clean sine wave, and if you see spikes in it at the apexes, then you look for arcing type situations. Yes, to answer your question, yes, there's thousands, thousands of characteristics that you can see on signals. Brushed DC motors create their own signatures, and they're very, very distinctive. You can see the flyback as the armature rings if they're not filtered. Same is true of, again, all the motors on your car create their own types of noise. If you get an idea for the frequency or the sound of it, if it's going tick, 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 it's obviously not a high-speed electric motor. If it's buzzing at a very high frequency, it's obviously not spark plug ignition. Alternator whine is extremely distinctive just by the tone. You can hear how it varies with the RPM in your car. I had a similar alternator issue with my vehicle, and it turned out I had a wire that failed in the connector to the radio. It was plugged into a cigarette lighter plug. It flexed a lot. Half of the strands were broken. I cut off the bad chunk of wire, put it right back in the cigarette lighter plug. Boom, the alternator noise was completely gone.
Okay, thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for, and it's interesting that both sound and visual through a scope can reveal a lot of those same things. So I'm glad to hear about that. That's interesting, and the characteristic types of noise is interesting as well. Okay, and then. Other comments about auto difficulties, and one of the things I guess that comes to my mind is, and we've talked about it before a bit when we talked antenna installations on cars, is the interaction of metals that are connected physically but not necessarily connected well electrically, and the noise that those joints can produce. Somebody want to perhaps define that a bit better and explain what's going on there?
W0 ASP, I can take a shot at that.
ASP, go ahead.
Well, when you have two dissimilar metals, especially copper and aluminum, they corrode very differently. And what happens is if you get some corrosion between copper and aluminum, or some contact between them that is not prevented from being corroded, they will set up essentially a diode action, and any diode action will rectify any RF into, it's essentially a detector, like a crystal radio detector, and it will turn RF into, it will demodulate that RF into noise. So the solution is to either not connect to similar metals, or if you do, use an intermediate metal that isn't compatible with both of them, or at the very least use an antioxidant compound, W0ASP.
Okay. And are there particular noise that this will produce, or is this mostly going to affect your RF pattern here? I don't think I'm wording that exactly the way I want. But we are talking about something that can just create what seems like random noise. Am I right there?
It'll seem random. What it is typically is two different radio frequencies going into your antenna will interact, and this diode rust detector, if you will create the sum and difference of those frequencies. And the sum and difference can be in your passband.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So we have very much active noise noise producers, and what I would almost call passive, although there's certainly an active content to it, to the diode action of that metal, but not something that is directly connected to power, I guess you'd say. So interesting different sources of noise. And by the way, Terry, did you ever figure out your clutch noise system, or your clutch noise difficulty that you were having?
Well, Kevin, I'm glad you asked, because if you hadn't, I would have asked to bring it up. No, I have not. I have a 2000 era, built in 2001 car that has an engine computer, and on the AM radio, about, all frequencies on AM below 2 megahertz, it is not an alternator noise. It is a lower frequency noise. It does not depend on engine speed, but it does depend if I push the clutch in or not. I have determined that it comes from the engine computer, because if I pull that off, everything stops. And it is radiated, not conducted, because I've used an external radio and noted that it also gets the interference as well as the radio built into the car.
NYY?
NYY, go.
Does the noise occur when the clutch pedal is depressed and cease when the clutch pedal is released?
Exactly the opposite, Bart. Bart, it disappears when I push in the clutch.
That. Okay. The reason I asked that question, and now I'm questioning my own thinking, could be backwards. I was thinking you have yourself a little Wimshurst machine there. But when the clutch is released, the pressure plate is engaged and it's not spinning freely. You don't have this insulator plate spinning between two metal discs. Okay, interesting. Go ahead, Dave. I'm sorry, back to net. This is a controlled net. Pardon me.
That's okay. Go ahead, Dave.
Does your vehicle, first, what's the make of the vehicle, and does it have a little shift light?
Dave, it's an 01 PT Cruiser, and it does not have a shift light. And the level of noise is inversely correlated, but not strongly inversely correlated, to the number of other electronic devices that I have on the car, for example, the headlights. If I turn the headlights on, the noise goes down a little bit.
Any additional light you can shed on that, Dave? Obviously, there was a reason you asked about the shift light there. Did that give you any info?
Well, I was thinking about the voltage regulator after you said there was no shift light. Looks like the 01 PT Cruiser has a external voltage regulator, and there could be an issue with that thing.
Okay. Terry, does that give you any questions or comments?
Dave, would this external voltage regulator be in effect when the engine is not running? Because when the engine is not running, the noise disappears not immediately, but eventually, say after a few tens to 20s of seconds.
You know, I imagine in the computer-controlled cars these days that any part of the system or the car's electrical system is going to be talking to that voltage regulator. It's not a simple, like, 3-wire voltage regulator. It looks like it has 2 large electrical hookups that connect to it. So I can imagine that it would be. And there may be some capacitor or something that needs to discharge that takes 20 seconds for it to discharge before the noise goes away.
It's the squirrel's heart rate decreasing, K0 PRB.
Phil, don't make me laugh.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, so let me just see if I understood you, Dave. You were, I think the question was, would that regulator be running when the engine is stopped? And I think you were essentially saying that it would be because of the other electrical stuff involved, but that there might be a capacitor that's discharging that makes that noise stop after it's discharged. Did I get that straight?
Yeah, that that device may be putting noise into the electrical system of the car, and it could be 20 seconds before the capacitors inside the device have discharged once the power is taken away for it to stop giving the noise.
Okay. So now we come, well, first of all, any additional comments, Terry?
Yeah, but I think this is a separate problem and it may confuse the situation. But whenever I turn on the defrosters for the rear window, I get a lot of noise on 2 meters. The other noise is on 1 megahertz on the AM broadcast band. But when I turn the defrosters on the rear windows, I get a lot of 2 meter interference.
And this is not necessarily related to the noise. I mean, this is constant, and it's regardless of how your clutch is. It's a completely separate noise that you're getting, correct?
Correct. That's a constant noise that does not depend on anything else that I have been able to determine in the vehicle.
Okay, anybody have a comment about that?
NYY.
NYY.
The noise you're talking about on 2 meters, do you hear that, I mean, just with an open squelch, or do you hear that superimposed on another carrier coming into the receiver?
I'm sorry, Bart, I don't remember. It's been quite a while since I've used the defroster on the car.
Okay, I just wondered. If it was enough if it was enough to create a signal that you could hear, that would be fairly easy to troubleshoot. If it's simply superimposing an unwanted tone on a received signal, I would more suspect that it's coming in through the power and take a different tack with that.
Oh, I was hearing it when I was using an HT that was not connected to the power system. I've only recently installed my mobile radio.
Very interesting. I would try, if you can find one of the connections to the defroster and put a small capacitor between that and ground. It sounds like perhaps the wiring and maybe the defroster itself are being resonated by the current controller, and I don't know what frequency that runs at, but there is a current controller for the defroster.
Fascinating. I know at least one of the little horizontal conducting lines is broken because that doesn't defrost in that location.
Which is why the little current controller has been installed. So as that resistance drops, as the resistance increases, it drives it a little harder and a little harder, so the rest of it still keeps working. Anyway, I'm not clear on their control algorithms for that, but I know they're not just switches anymore in 0 NYY.
All right, this is N7GES with the TechNet. At some point we get noise that we know is generated by something in the car that's digitally generating noise. We talked a little, Bart, you and I talked a little bit about tracing some of those things and doing something about those things. Is that something you can talk about a bit? Analyzing the car computer and then isolating noise from particular sources that are certainly having to be there, but you can't. It's something you can't just circumvent, but still something you can do about it.
Yes, and I wanted to say that if you, pardon me, a bit hoarse this morning or this evening. If you can detect the noise without the engine running, that opens up a whole world of troubleshooting possibilities because you have a bazillion fuses you can pull, or a few dozen, and one at a time, and you can easily identify the associated components by pulling fuses. If your engine has to be running in order to create the noise, now that gives you a different set of things to troubleshoot that are a little bit more difficult. And one of the things that was it Doug mentioned earlier today, grab a nickel. If you discover that your anti-lock brakes are creating noise, you cannot remove the anti-lock brakes from your car and safely drive your car. Well, you're not supposed to. But that's not necessarily the case. If your anti-lock brakes modulate at 10 kilohertz, and that 10 kilohertz gets into your radio, and you've done power filtering already on your radio, which, by the way, can make a huge difference, as can good grounding, then you can put a filter that will specifically block a band stop filter or a very narrow filter that will block 10 kilohertz from coming through the power line on the radio. And there goes a large percentage of your noise. A very small capacitor in the case of a noisy motor, windshield wiper motor, something like that. A capacitor to ground, which most of them have them, but if the cap fails, you get a noisy motor. You can put that bypass cap on the motor and quiet things down. And I mean, there's an awful lot of possibilities on a car, and there's an awful lot of different remedies out there. Doesn't necessarily mean doing away with the offending element.
Okay, any additional comments in this direction? EMP. EMP, go.
Yeah, a lot of us, especially the older ones, are used to, when we have something that's creating RFI, we're accustomed to immediately start sticking capacitors on it or putting inductors in series with it to try to solve the problem. Some modern vehicle systems, that could be an extremely bad idea. Things like the fuel injectors are designed to work on a specific pulse of electricity, a specific profile. Things like the anti-lock brakes and skid control and stuff like that as well. And if you start modifying those waveforms, bad things can happen. The least of which might be decreased fuel economy, and the worst of which might be a fiery crash. So you want to be careful on what you try bypassing. Obviously windshield wipers is fine and things like that, alternators, but some of the systems really expect a certain waveform, and like you alluded to earlier, there's communication that goes on between different parts of a modern vehicle. So a different approach might just be to try to isolate your DC power source as much as possible, which could mean a second battery in the trunk or somewhere else, and using a second deep cycle battery for your radios and filtering the DC that charges that battery as best you can. That might, ultimately be what it takes in some of these vehicles to get clean power and quiet radio performance and zero EMP.
Okay, so we have a couple of different options there, either of which can work depending on what we're trying to do, and some cautions as to things we want to be careful about doing in certain situations. Very good. Other questions or comments? Vehicle, home, electrical systems, in-home, out-of-home, any of these things, or trying to locate a particular noise source. Any of these subjects that anybody wants to add additional comments about?
W0ASP.
ASP, go.
I've had fairly good success by locating noise sources in the HF band by using a single turn loop antenna that's about 2 foot on a side, or take a 10-foot piece of copper and bend it into a circle. Make yourself a loop antenna. As long as the antenna is about less than a tenth of a wavelength, it has a very, very sharp null perpendicular to the plane of the loop, and that can be a very, very good direction finding instrument.
NYY.
NYY, go.
That is one of my favorite toys to play with, and it is called a small DF loop antenna.
And when you get really close to the source, you need an even smaller loop, something only a few inches in diameter.
And that close-in work is where the shielded loop comes in really good too. Basically, it's a piece of tubing with one gap in the tube and a piece of wire through the center of the tube, and that piece of wire is then connected to your receiver. Their designs are a little bit finicky, but they are incredibly sensitive. N0NYY. And sorry, we broke out of the directed net behavior. Shame on us.
You know, it's okay. We had several good comments that led one into another, and we didn't lose control anyway, so it's all right. This is N7GES in the TechNet. Good comments there. Very interesting as well. Any additional comments on loops?
Well, other than to say that Bart is exactly right, I'm sorry, all of my really small loops are shielded loops because they're made out of coax cable.
Well, we have a lot of tools available that are simple, as well as the more complex tools like the SDR and a spectrum or a scope of some sort. Any other tools that we might use for locating noise sources? We chatted a bit earlier, Bart and I chatted a little bit earlier about an AM radio with its ferrite rod antenna, and I believe you said that the end of that rod is where it would pick up the noise source the best, so rod pointing at the noise source, and that's generally going to be the long direction of the radio, I would imagine, in a lot of cases, although not always. Am I correct on that, Bart?
I believe so. I should know that, and I'm trying to recall in my brain. I believe that the loop stick antenna, the ferrite loop stick, is definitely more sensitive off the ends.
EMP.
EMP?
If whatever is radiating your noise source is vertical, like a vertical whip antenna or some vertical structure, and you're some distance away, and your ferrite loop stick is horizontal, which it normally is in the radio, it's most sensitive off the sides, and the null is off the end, because you're looking at the magnetic component coming off that antenna, off the source, so you're going to have these rings of magnetic flux radiating outward. And when that loop stick is broadside to those, that flux is going long ways through the rod and energizing the turns on the coil, and you're getting your most sensitivity. And when you point one end towards the source, you get a null. And you can try this just on a AM radio station, which is a vertical antenna. And your peak is off the side, and the null is off the end.
ASP comment?
No comments on that?
ASP?
ASP, go.
Greg, of course that's for a small loop where the sensitivity of the loop is perpendicular to the wound elements. Once you become resonant, that becomes different.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure the ferrite loop stick is still small compared to a wavelength of AM broadcast band. And for instance, my CC radio sitting here that I used to listen to 600 KCOL, I had to turn it so that it was broadside to the tower, which is actually up in Wellington, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You're correct that all those magnetic loop antennas that are wound around a ferrite core inside of these AM receivers are small compared to the wavelength, and therefore they conform to the small loop behavior, that the null is in the plane of the loop and the maximum is perpendicular to it. And I have one, a Sangean ATS 908X that I use, battery powered. It'll do everything from 150 kilohertz up through FM band. Battery powered, and it's got external input and external gain and an S meter. Wonderful QRM hunter.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay. Any additional comments or questions? All right. Any other topics that anybody has a question about before we quit for the evening? Even off of the subject of RFI. Well, I'm sure that we have not necessarily covered all the aspects, but I know that we got a lot of very good info here. So I appreciate everybody chiming in and offering what they could here. There's a lot of complexities going on, and it's always good to know how you can handle some of this stuff. All right, we got a lot of yeses for next week, and I think the only bit of fly in the ointment might be our YouTube stream. Dave, do you have any additional info or wishes or recommendations or anything like that for me?
Yeah, Kevin, I should be able to be back by the time that net starts, W0DDZ.
Okay, very good. Well, then we will plan on next week, as we've had so many people that are interested in next week, and I appreciate everybody being so dedicated here, and that's terrific. So let's, how about this for a topic? Diagnostic equipment. What do I need in my shack? What kind of equipment for diagnosing and checking signals and transmission and that sort of thing? There's some very, very obvious things, but I would bet that there are a number of other things that people haven't thought about, and I think there could be some interesting discussions. And we could even go so far as what brands do people prefer and why. But diagnostic equipment for the ham shack. Let's give that one a try for next week. And any other questions or comments before we sign off for the day? Okay, once again, I do appreciate anybody's comments or suggestions. Is the net serving you as you would like? Are there things that you'd like to see us do that we're not doing? Or something that we're doing that you'd like to see done slightly differently or in an increased manner or in a different way? All of those things are important. Again, the easiest thing I think to do is to email elmers@ncarc.net. Remember, earlier was mentioned that NCARC does have a library. We got lots of great, some are older but still good reference books from the ARRL, which are fairly expensive if you're going to buy new ones. But we've got a lot of those in our lending library, and those are available. So please contact Joe about those and take advantage of them, because they're good information and they're freely available for you as members. So don't let them collect dust. I believe that's all I need to mention. We'll be here next week, even though it's Memorial Day, and we'll do the best we can. And if we have if we still end up having a low turnout for whatever reason, then we'll cover the topic again at another time or something there. But at least we'll give it a try, since so many people seem to think that they were going to be around. Thank you again very much, and thanks to the NCARC for hosting the net. And I will say 73, and we'll return the repeater to normal use. We'll see you again next week. This is N7GES. We'll be clear.
This presentation was brought to you by the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.